Welcome, welcome, welcome. Here we are, About Face Veterans' first live stream. It's 5 o'clock on Monday, October 19th, and we are coming at you live with a panel of experts planned to talk about the liberation of the Puerto Rican people in relation to the statehood vote that is coming up on the 3rd. So we're coming to you today live, and today we have Brittany Deveros, Monisha Rios, and Giovanni Reyes, and we're super happy to be here today. So what's going on in relation to the Puerto Rican statehood vote and the liberation of Puerto Rican people is I'm looking here at the website at Estadidad.com. Sorry if my pronunciation is terrible, but it says here, the symbolic query, statehood, yes or no? It is a strategy imposed by the New Progressive Party to get votes in the general elections and stay in power. They will not get away with it. We are going after the decolonization of Puerto Rico. So here we go. Guys, take it away. You want to do a quick intro, tell a little bit about yourselves and your relationship to Puerto Rican diaspora.
Well,
take it
I'm
away,
Monisha
Brittany.
Rios.
Okay.
Oh, go for it, Britt.
Okay, sure. I'll just give a little bit about myself, and I'm sure, I can share more of my story as we go, but my name is Brittany Ramos Deveros. I use she, her pronouns, and I live in New York on the continent, and I grew up in Texas as someone who didn't really grow up around any other members of the Puerto Rican diaspora. And so, and my father is an Afro-Puerto Rican man who grew up on the island and moved, basically fled poverty and, growing up in orphanages to, come here to the continent hoping to find a better life, and ended up having a really rough time on the streets. And so for me, his hope for me for a better life was always very explicitly really trying to push me to become as Americanized and as integrated and assimilated as possible. So much so that he told me I should aspire to be as white as possible, that I should aspire to, he didn't want to cook Puerto Rican food. He refused to speak Spanish to me or say much about our lineage. And so as an adult, learning about the history of why someone would want to shed their culture like that, I've really understood it as a function of the colonization of our people and this narrative that we should, try to be as American as possible, or that all the answers are held in America. And so that's the perspective I'm coming from. As a person who's never been able to live at the, on the homelands, I hold a lot of humility and reverence for the reality that I have grown up with a different experience and a different set of privileges, and yet this is still my fight. And so I'm in this process now as an adult of learning how to reclaim and reintegrate into our roots and our culture, and trying to familiarize myself with the politics of the islands and the histories of the islands. Giovanni and Monisha have both played an important role in my growth and learning around that. And so it's a real honor to be here with them. And the last thing I'll say is that the place where I do hold some level of expertise and knowledge to offer, I think, is in a broader analysis of the way that imperialism and colonization has played out and continues to play out with the United States as an epicenter. For that, I joined the military. I deployed, and after participating in that war and coming back, I realized that I had a lot to learn about why we were really in these wars. And that started a journey for me in joining About Face Veterans Against the War and getting involved in this struggle and learning about colonization and how it plays out in various manifestations, whether it be in the Middle East or in a neo-colony like Puerto Rico.
Very cool. Let's keep it going. Who's next? Giovanni?
Yeah.
Yeah, there you
yeah. How you guys doing? I was on mute. So yeah, thank you for inviting me. Mike, and thank you all for putting all this together. So I am part of the. I'm the son of a Puerto Rican mother and a Dominican father. I was born. I'm part of both the Dominican and Puerto Rican diaspora. I was born in New York, Brooklyn, New York. I spent my early childhood between New York and Patillas, Puerto Rico, which is the hometown of my mother. From Puerto Rico, my father worked at a garage, and my mom worked in a factory in Puerto Rico. My dad was a mechanic. He joined the Puerto Rican National Guard, and then from there he went active. He went active through the army. So we were uprooted outside of and that's pretty much when my brother was born. My brother was born soon after he joined active duty, and then we were pretty much left the island to his first duty station being Colorado. Then we went to Hawaii. And then my mother, my brother, and I returned back to Puerto Rico. This time to Guayama, Puerto Rico. My father continued with the military, and from there, I went back. I had a different consciousness, coming from Hawaii, to Puerto Rico. It was a huge shock for me there, coming from an English-speaking school to a Spanish-speaking school. I spoke Spanish, but at the time I didn't really read it well. I didn't write it, so I was having a rough time in school in Puerto Rico. But I adapted, overcame it, and I became actually well in grammar and Spanish and everything. Then we moved again, this time to Virginia. And in Virginia, we met with my father again, and we're living inside of a military installation in Virginia. And there, it was another culture shock for me in Virginia. For the area Virginia is predominantly white and black communities there, living side by side, but at the same time, two separate nations. Whereas in Puerto Rico, the thought was that the United States was just one nation, and it was just the be all and the be all and end all and everything. We have this perceived notion of what the United States is supposed to be. But when I got to Virginia, I rapidly noticed that they were actually two separate nations living within one nation, within more of the Caucasian side, and then more of the Afro-American side. I was approached because of my skin tone when I first got to Virginia. I was firstly approached at school and everything by African Americans, by black kids in school, befriended me first, and so I pretty much eventually adopted more of an Afro-American pretty much socialization in Virginia. And by doing that, I also got introduced to pretty much Black liberation struggles and movement through that stuff that they didn't really taught you in school, but but learning from my friends and what they talked about, the movies they watched, the shows they watched, my own research. I got into reading different things, right? So I pretty much I learned about another separate struggle that I wasn't taught about the United States in our regular school or in Puerto Rico or in the United States. So right there, I found out there were just two different stories there, two different peoples there, and two different entities. So right there and then, identify mostly with the Afro-American people, and by doing that, I discovered my own Africanness. Belonging, my Afro-Caribbeanness, which before that I didn't have that consciousness, but in Virginia, that's when I developed that. And I started seeing the contradictions in the United States. I started understanding the different histories and contradictions that pretty much and I made a connection between the colonization of Puerto Rico. Before that, in Puerto Rico, I leaned, not really leaned to any type of political ideology, but in Virginia, that's when I started leaning towards the political ideology of independence for Puerto Rico, because I started seeing how the colonization of Puerto Rico is, and how the internal colonization of the United States is. The different sectors of the United States that live within, in the margins of the larger society. We live in a type of colonization, whether they be black, whether they be natives, whether it be poor whites, they live in some form of colonization, some form of bubble. So yeah, from Virginia, I joined the Army, 93. I was conflicted in my military service, right? I already joined the military somewhat politicized. In my times I was an occupier in Korea, occupied in Germany. I was an occupier in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, participated in that the conflict that pretty much tore the country up. So when the Iraq War started, I was already conflicted by my military service. So when it started right there and then, I knew that I didn't want to take part of this. And as a Puerto Rican, I didn't want to, I didn't have no animosity towards the Iraqi people. So I didn't know. So there was no reason for me to take part of it. There's no reason for any Puerto Ricans to take part of any U.S. wars. So I left the military in 2007. Since then, I joined a veterans-led organization, anti-war veterans-led organization named About Face, Veterans Against the War, and here I am now.
Very good, very good. Thanks, everyone. So Monisha, I think you're probably the most dialed in, the most expert. You have the best analysis of what's going on. Can you break it down a little bit for us about what's going on in Puerto Rico and the upcoming vote on November 3rd?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So as you read in the beginning, this plebiscite, the status referendum that's happening is kind of a farce. And this is the 6th one to be imposed on the Puerto Rican people. The first was in 1967. And it's highly recognized among a large portion of the independence movement to be illegitimate, essentially, as a means of practicing our self-determination, because it's something that caters to the settler colonial state of the United States and doesn't necessarily afford a real participatory democratic process of all of the people of Puerto Rico who aren't necessarily led by their class interests to align with the United States. And essentially, these plebiscites or status referendums have been used to promote a particular narrative within the United States that the majority of Puerto Ricans want to become a state. And the thing about that is there is a high rate of boycott of this vote because of its essential illegitimacy. And that in and of itself is a type of vote, right? It's a vote of no confidence. And so the byproduct of that, unfortunately, how that vote of no confidence is exploited by the US propaganda machine is that then it becomes this narrative of the majority of Puerto Ricans want statehood. And so this time around, now we have the Puerto Rican summer 2019, where the people took to the streets and essentially ousted Ricky Rosselló, who, again, something that people need to remember is that when the U.S. invaded Puerto Rico, it was not for Puerto Rico to ever become independent. And the decision for Puerto Rico to engage in the type of relationship that we had back then with the United States was made by a small number of people who were part of the settler colonizer ruling class of Puerto Rico. So ultimately, the decision of the Treaty of Paris of 1898 was not made by the Puerto Rican people. And so for 122 years now, we went from the Spanish Empire, who was fighting with the British, the Dutch, the French, because of our military value as the gateway to Latin America and the dominance of that trade source for their extractionary purposes. And now 122 years has been with the United States. So ultimately, we have yet to really have the opportunity to exercise our basic human right to decide whether or not we want to be free and independent and exercise our full sovereignty, or if we actually, as a people, do want to be in any way associated with the United States empire. So that's where we're at. And the thing about the party that's ruling now, and why the imposition of this status referendum right now is so important, is that this current governor was not voted in. She was replacing Ricky. She's just a placeholder. But while she's been in there, there's been a rollback similar to what's happened in the United States with fundamental human rights for LGBT. Sorry, I always mess that up because I'm dyslexic. For our trans sisters and brothers, for non-binary relatives, for women. The violence against women has shot up so much that, you know, Puerto Rico's called one of the most dangerous places in the world for women, and have been in the streets on the Big Island calling for a state of emergency. So it's very much a right-wing fascista regime, essentially, that has maintained power in conjunction with the United States all this time. So what they did with this law, Law 51/2020, 51-2020, is with this so-called referendum, they made the choice, sí or no, yes or no. And they attached the ruling political party now to the yes vote. And then they attached the Puerto Rican Independence Party, the PEEP, to the no vote. And they made it to where only the PEEP, only the Puerto Rican Independence Party was allowed or sanctioned by them to do a counter campaign to statehood. Anyone outside of that, a citizens coalition, for instance, would essentially break this law. And so the Vote No campaign, or Sobre las razones para votar no, which in Spanish is there are many reasons to vote no, began as an act of civil disobedience and resistance to this law that was founded unconstitutional. So, and the Department of Justice has already written a letter saying, you know, even if you vote yes to statehood on this thing, we're not going to honor it. We don't feel you can handle your business. We don't want you as a state. Yet this political party is continuing to push this narrative, which is sort of what we're here to counter today. Not only do people believe the myths that we're going to get into here in a minute, that statehood would equal and equitable treatment of Puerto Rican peoples. There's another myth that says that we would be essentially joining a multinational country that recognizes different nationalities and that has equality for different nationalities. You can keep your culture and your language. And so, you know, a lot of Puerto Ricans who live on the continent, who live on occupied Turtle Island, know that that's not the case. So without further ado, shall we get into it? Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, you mean the myths specifically?
Yeah, is that cool?
Should we go one by one through the myths? Yeah. Okay, so myth number one, if you go to the website on estadidad.com, which is easily translatable into English. Once you go to the website, at the top right inside the address bar, you can simply click on the little translate button and click it over to English if you need to, because it comes up in Spanish initially. So you do that, and then you go down and you can see the myths. And myth number one is statehood is a civil rights issue as citizens of the United States. So can you break that down for us? Yeah.
So again, it treats it like a civil rights issue compared to an international humanitarian law issue or an issue of actual sovereignty and independence. It completely ignores the colonial aspect of the relationship that we have, and with that, it sort of diminishes the reality. It whitewashes it a little bit because it assumes that we are full American citizens, and even though the Jones Act of 1917 did establish a level of citizenship for Puerto Ricans, our colonial relationship, I forgot how to translate ELA, freely associated state or unincorporated territory, we retain some of our sovereignty. So that's bunk. But also, to go deeper into the myth, this is the one that really says that we'll have equal treatment as citizens of the United States. So is it cool if I ask one of our panelists about that?
Yeah, let me jump in. So one of the things that we need to remember that Puerto Rico is a non-incorporated state, or is non-incorporated territory of the United States, meaning that within the U.S. Constitution, Congress pretty much have sovereignty or have rule over all American territories, whether they be populated or, like Puerto Rico or Guam, or whether they not be populated, like Diego Garcia the Pacific Ocean, right? It's an island without a population, right? It's a big military installation. So both of them are incorporated states. So you see here that Puerto Rico is in the same level. It's in the same level as the island of Diego Garcia, which is a desolated island with no population, only has a military installation, but they're in the same category. It's a non-incorporated state where Congress had pretty much rule over, not the president, not the resident, what's it called? The resident, what's her name? Jennifer, the resident in Puerto Rico.
Commissioner Jennifer
resident
Gonzalez.
commissioner. Yeah, not the mayor, so it's Congress is the ultimate, voice of what's happening, right? So the reason Puerto Rico is considered a non-incorporated state because from the beginning, since 1898, there was really no intention of incorporating Puerto Rico into the United States. And just giving you an example of when after the American War of Independence, right? One of the first battles against the indigenous population of the United States of the continent was in a battle, in what we call today the Midwest, the Ohio territories. That was pretty much the first effort to expand westward, right? It was the defeat to the coalitions of different indigenous people in that area, what we call today, Ohio, and that was with the intention of incorporating those territories. So once those native people were defeated, right, then Anglo population started moving in those territories, right, and those territories was taken as incorporated, right, meaning that when enough Anglo population, right, populate these lands that were taken from the native, owners, then it could apply for statehood, right? So those and continues to go forward into reaching California, right? So all those territories, right, whether Ohio, whether Louisiana, all those territories, right, were incorporated territories, right? Right, because they were with the intention of incorporating to the Union. Whereas Puerto Rico, Guam, Philippines, they're non-incorporated territory because there was never no intention of incorporating them into the United States and to becoming the states. That's one thing that you have that has to be pointed. Two, the ELA, when Manisha mentioned about the ELA with the Estado Libre Asociado, which in English is have no translation. And the way people recognize it in English is Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, which really means nothing because if you look at it, Australia is a Commonwealth, right? And Massachusetts is a Commonwealth, right? So Puerto Rico does not even look like Australia. It doesn't look like Massachusetts, right? Massachusetts is a state and Australia is an independent country, right? Yet all three have the title of Commonwealth. So where I was going with this. So the ELA pretty much was something that was installed, that was the creation of the first governor of Puerto Rico, Luis Muñoz Marín, the first elected governor of Puerto Rico, which is he was elected in 1948 after the Second World War, when the UN was established and the decolonization process started. I mean, the countries in the Caribbean were eventually decolonized, the countries in Africa were eventually decolonized, the countries in Asia and South Asia were eventually decolonized and formed their own independent government, right? Well, when it came to Puerto Rico, the United States said that Puerto Rico is a separate case. So Puerto Rico does not fall under, let's say, India, does not fall under Jamaica, does not fall under the same category as Vietnam, for example, right? Puerto Rico is a separate case, and it's an internal case of the United States, and the United States will deal with it. That's what it was said at the UN. So pretty much right there and then, the ELA was created, pretty much to stifle that, to give the allure that Puerto Rico is an independent country or an associated country with the United States, political associated country with the United States. But that's just a farce. Because Puerto Rico never really stopped being a territory, never ever stopped being a dependent territory to the United States, right? Where pretty much the ultimate word in every decision made in Puerto Rico, Congress has it. The president, the president can declare, like, Puerto Ricans have been in every war of the 20th century, every American war of the 20th century, but Puerto Rico never declared war to anyone. Yet we have Puerto Rican soldiers, right? They make up a very disproportionate size of the U.S. military, and Puerto Rican soldiers, right, have made a disproportionate contribution in the death of soldiers as well. I'm gonna end right there, hitting those two myths, and I'll pass it on to the next person.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you for that in-depth analysis and history of Puerto Rico. Myth number 2, statehood is promoted by the plebiscite is a decolonizing formula. Man, break that down. What does that mean, Monisha?
So this, as I was saying a little bit before, and then I want to hear what Brittany has to say about that first myth as well. It's not decolonization. Your colonizer doesn't get to decide how you decolonize. And also too, it's not an opportunity for us to really, as a people, decide. It's not a true practice of self-determination. So what they're promoting is false. It is a false idea of what decolonization looks like. And it's something that is actually there to serve that party's aims. It's to serve the current ruling class of Puerto Rico's desires, and to also promote a type of relationship with the United States that would help them maintain power, which they've pretty much had all this time while they've worked with the US empire. So with that, though, I want to hear, Brittany, what do you think about that first myth and statehood equaling equality?
The unmute function here. Yeah, thanks, Monisha. I'll be brief because, I think Giovanni covered so much with the history that he offered, and then, you did with your analysis. I'll just say it's so common for the United States. I think that it's really important for us to think about what forces are at play, right, across the political landscape. And I'm not as familiar with the details of the political landscape on the island, right? But on the mainland, I know that we deal with neoconservatism, neo-fascism, and neoliberalism, right? And I specifically want to speak to neoliberalism because it's an ideology that tells us that we can have some reform along liberal ideologies that will save us, and it masks over the economic motives behind what is actually happening, right? And so in order to understand why statehood is being positioned as a civil right, it's because there are good arguments for the ways that the civil rights of Puerto Rican people are being oppressed and suppressed, right? And there are real civil rights violations that are happening on the island. But we need to understand those violations as things that are ultimately driven by economic exploitation, in the way that, as Giovanni spoke to, they always have been, right? And economic exploitation through the means of military control, right? Economic control, some of the other ways that these methods of coercion play out. And so while it's true that there are civil rights crises happening, we have to go deeper than saying okay, the solution to that is to try to fit more deeply into this system that is oppressing us, right? And that's often what my father, on a personal level, right, that was his strategy, is my life has been so terrible because of these conditions that I want to try to squeeze and assimilate into this culture and into this system that has ultimately been built on our people's backs and to harm us. And the problem is that when we do that, we still, you never stop being a Puerto Rican, right? People never knew quite what race I was, but they knew that I wasn't white. They knew that and ultimately that still creates an environment where we're never going to be treated as equals on interpersonal levels or on structural levels, right? And certainly not on interpersonal levels until we deal with the structural level. And so to me, this whole referendum is an opportunity for us to say, and particularly for people on the island, right, to say, what do we want in the long term, right? If we know that this referendum isn't going to be honored or validated, then what is the utility that it plays in this moment? It plays, and if we know that its intention is to play a propagandic role for those same neoliberal forces who are telling us that, oh, it's our fault that things aren't better on the island, or if we would just assimilate better, or become fully part of this system, then we would be liberated. But we know that that's not true, right? We know that that's not true for the descendants of enslaved peoples who were stolen and brought to the mainland. We know that that's not true for those people on the island either, right? And we know that that's not true for indigenous nations across Turtle Island, or what indigenous folks call the mainland of the United States. And they have a very similar setup of, oh, you can be fully part of this country, but also maintain your culture and your sovereignty. And we've just seen in tangible ways how much that's not true. And it's my opinion, and I say this with, again, a lot of humility about the position that I'm holding in relationship to folks who are actually living on the island and their conditions. But it's my opinion that we're going through a real political reckoning right now. And it would be powerful for us to say that, yes, we want to fight for rights or whatever in the short term, we want to fight for benefits, but our long-term vision, what we really want is liberation for Puerto Rico. We want true sovereignty and true wholeness for our island that has been denied for hundreds of years now. And it just, from my perspective, knowing how this, how statehood actually ends up operating in relationship to indigenous peoples, I think it would be so powerful for our people to really stand up and say, no, we have to live in the conditions that we have to live in right now to survive. But our North Star, the thing that we're working towards ultimately, is true liberation and independence.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. We're doing this kind of improv, but I got a question that's just kind of burning a hole in my brain right now that I'm hoping that some you can provide some background and analysis for. So Puerto Rico had a Hurricane Maria, right? So from what I understand is that the island was just annihilated, and the people were totally left out to dry after the hurricane. Sorry, that's a poor choice of words, but it was just absolutely devastating. As far as I know, the island is still devastated from the hurricane. So I'm not sure what would make people think that the United States empire has really any interest in building up Puerto Rico. How do we deal with that? How does this relate to the rebuilding of the island after natural disasters like that? Is that a question that makes sense? Should I set it up better? Okay, you're muted. Monisha, break it down for me.
Yeah, no, that's good. So I think part of it, and I admit also that I am not totally versed yet because I started repatriating in January. I moved back to Vieques because Puerto Rico is an archipelago, and people are used to calling it the island because the island of Puerto Rico is named Puerto Rico, and then there's also Vieques and Culebra. So technically islands, plural. But what I understand and what I hear people say often is that there would be access to more resources, that it's our ELA status, our ELA status, that limits our access to the types of resources we would need to be able to recover from that as fully as we could, which I feel sad when I hear, because we know from Hurricane Katrina that that's not true. We know from a majority of the disasters that have occurred in the United States. We know from Flint. We know from the way that equality and equity do not exist for our relatives there who are living on reservations, who were forced off their lands, who live around military bases, who are getting sick because of fighting for our rights. And then we know from the descendants of African slaves, and we know from our Latin American relatives too, that none of that is true. So that's what I think about that.
I think you're right.
Great question.
It's excellently put.
Yeah. Can I jump in also? I think to answer your question, right, and this is for pretty much for people in Puerto Rico. I encourage them to see, and with this question that you put, encourage you to see how natural disasters or man-made disasters are handled here in the United States. Being that we're living in under statehood, right, and seeing if the way that people are treated here, the way that people are abandoned here by their government, should be a cautionary tale to Puerto Ricans. For example, Manisha just mentioned Katrina. How was Katrina handled? It wasn't really handled very well. They took advantage of the conditions in Katrina. They took advantage of the opportunity, and they ramped up a whole lot of neoliberal packages. Right? They pretty much ramped up a whole lot of selling off enterprises, to private companies. Pretty much this whole school system was privatized. So they took advantage of a disaster. What Naomi Klein talks about disaster capitalism. So it took advantage of the situation in Katrina to pretty much advance capitalism, to advance a profit for a few, while the majority of the people struggle. While a large base of the New Orleans population were pretty much stifled off all over the country, not being able to return to their homes. Here in Texas, we have a lot of people from New Orleans that, from the era that were pretty much brought here as quote unquote refugees, right? But they haven't been able to return back, to their homes. So we got to see those lessons. How was the people in Detroit started? How were the people in Detroit treated? Detroit was to be a bubbling city, bustling city. At one point, it was like one of the top industrial cities in the United States that had over 3 million people living there, right? You got Motown, you got the auto industry, you got all this, right? But you go to Detroit now, it's like a ghost town. A lot of dilapidated homes, a lot of homes, empty homes set on fire. They have a population of several hundred thousand people. It used to be over 3 million people, not just several 100,000 people that left. How was Flint, Michigan treated? How people treated in the hills, in the coal mines, in the coal hills up in West Virginia. How are they treated? So you gotta see. So to answer your question, right, when it comes to natural disasters, when it comes to man-made disasters, right, you gotta see how our Americans or people who are living in the United States, who are living under statehood, how are they treated? And take that example, take that lesson, right, and pretty much you can come to a conclusion in how you will be treated too.
I'm muted. We have a question here in the comments. So Jake Tucker says, don't know if y'all are entertaining questions, but how does the Cuban response to Hurricane Maria play into the feeling of folks in Puerto Rico? That's what we have so far. If somebody wants to field that question, I think that'd be good.
What was the question?
How does the Cuban response to Hurricane Maria play into the feeling of folks living in Puerto Rico?
Y'all want to take that?
Yeah, and how has how has the Fuera Ricky movement played politically into this vote? Okay, so Jake, Brittany, do you want to jump in on that, or is it good if I go? Okay, so the thing to remember about Puerto Rico is that there's been a psychological warfare, essentially psychological operations going on constantly to influence the opinion of Puerto Ricans toward Cuba. And that has resulted in a lot of fear of Cuba, a lot of misunderstanding of what's actually happening there. And so, there's a strong anti-Cuba sentiment here. It's very conservative in Puerto Rico, contrary to what the Democratic Party wants to think. And that's huge. So there are folks who recognize that we could have, if we had our independence, if we were free and sovereign and able to engage in our own relationship, we could have easily not suffered the way that we did. We wouldn't have had to lose over 4,000 lives for absolutely no good reason. And we could have had access to the doctors that we see saving so many lives in the world now who should have gotten the Nobel Peace Prize. And just like, so I live here in Vieques, and here I forgot the day count, but we're at, since Hurricane Maria, with no hospital, still no hospital. We have an unreliable ferry system so that everybody who's here, who's suffering from the cancers and all the illnesses that come from 60 years of being bombed by the United States to defend our rights, can't get to their appointments on time. and have to go through horrible conditions to get to the ferry and are often turned away. And then, these are elders, these are sick people in wheelchairs and still with no hospital, so if we had been able to, and there are a lot of people who do understand this, and there are a lot of people who are eager to engage in international solidarity, to be in the world as a free, independent, and sovereign nation, to build our own relationships, who know we could have avoided all of this. Because other countries, including Venezuela, see us and respect our human dignity and worth. And I'll let somebody else take that second part of your question, Jake. Whoever wants it.
Okay, so to reiterate, I'm not sure how to say that word.
Fuera Ricky. It's
Yeah.
Ricky out, Ricky renuncia. How does the Fuera Ricky movement, how has it played politically into this vote?
Yeah, so I can jump in. So one of the things that Ricky was doing was wanting to create to have Puerto Rico a base, to make Puerto Rico a base of instability for the rest of Latin America, right? He probably announced it as well, inviting Venezuela's reaction to Venezuela's the Cubans pretty much to open Puerto Rico for that type of actions against those countries. Meanwhile, pretty much Puerto Ricans are suffering under the debt crisis. We're living under austerity. They imposed this debt on us for I think it was $75 billion that it's been declared unpayable, but yet they want to continue to squeeze blood out of the rocks, for us to pay. So we've been pretty much under some type of austerity, deep austerity. Under Ricky, I think over 100 schools had to shut down. People were leaving. Left the country and drove, since we haven't seen this type of migration towards the United States since the 1950s. Today, we have more Puerto Ricans living in the United States than they do in Puerto Rico because of the conditions there. Crime skyrocketing, right? And pretty much the crimes of poverty. That's the best way to describe it. The crimes of poverty and frustrations that have been able to be cultivated in Puerto Rico because of our colonial style, because of the robbing of our dignity, not being able to have our own self-determination, right? To go there, right? So Ricky pretty much ignored all that was going on in Puerto Rico and wanted to further the integration of the United States into the United States, right? And one of the ways he was doing it is pretty much offering Puerto Rico as a beachhead, right, for American destabilization in places like Nicaragua, places like Venezuela and Colombia. So you have this warp, all these contradictions and his neglect of his own population, right? Pretty much was the force that was driving behind the young people, and I'm talking about the young people, the new generation, the Gen Xers that pretty much went out to the streets, without fear, because I'm from a generation of Puerto Ricans where it was taught to us that protesting was, particularly protesting against the United States and whatnot, was seen as devious, was seen as not being ungrateful and whatnot. But we got this new generation coming out with the black and white flags, pretty much talk about Ricky renuncia, pushing him out. First is Ricky, then everybody else. Pushing him out. So we saw this awakening. And I thought I was very positive, and I hope that continued to be cultivated, because after that there was some assemblies going on in Puerto Rico and outside of Puerto Rico. Puerto Ricans pretty much organizing to go forward into the our self-determination, to restructure the debt. And not only restructure the debt, I think that one of the things that they were talking about in Puerto Rico was to audit the debt, because they told us that we owe all this money, but no one knows where this money went. No one knows who we owe this money to. All we know, all we're told that we owe this money, and Obama put this dictatorship on us, right? Took away the power of the purse of the governor, right, and gave it to this panel of like 9 people, this group of 9 people to pretty much decide how to allocate the funds in Puerto Rico. So yeah. So I don't know if I went out on a tangent. I don't know if I went on a topic there, but that's some of the thoughts I had.
Giovanni knows his stuff. This is good. I'm kind of interested. We have one more question that I think would be worth answering. Maybe we could do it quickly. I don't know what PROMESA is, but has anyone explained what would happen to PROMESA and the debt if Puerto Rico were to become a state, or how that would play into the U.S., not even entertaining the idea? Can somebody break down what PROMESA is and what Rafael is suggesting here?
Brittany, do you want to jump in?
No, I think you should take it. You're living there. You should speak to this.
So I'm still learning the depths of PROMESA, but it's an Obama era project. Essentially, I don't exactly know the inner workings of how we got the debt. It's explained on the website. You can go to estadidad.no.com and learn a little bit more about it, but also there's a lot of information out there online. Essentially, PROMESA is an act to restructure the debt, that assigned a board, a fiscal control board, to try to fix the problem with austerity measures, essentially. So when PROMESA went into effect, schools started closing, the University of Puerto Rico started closing, conditions got worse for people, pensions were threatened. There's all sorts of problems more now, because, as always with austerity measures, it is to choke even more the poor folks who are being exploited, whose wealth they build is being taken from them, to pay off the debt, which is what countries under the International Monetary Fund have to do all the time now, right? Which is why there are countries now who are in revolt over their government signing on loans with the IMF. So it's essentially kind of a version of the IMF, as I understand it. And that played into the US not even entertaining the idea, because according to the US, you all can't manage your finances. So why would we want you? We had to give you PROMESA to help you fix your problems. So why would we want you? So that's how I understand it. And I'm definitely not the expert on that. I highly encourage everybody who's watching and listening, especially the person who asked that question, to dig deeper than me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it should be glaringly obvious to anyone that the idea that Puerto Rico would ever have any kind of debt to the United States is just absurd. With the amount of resources and labor and manpower and lives they've given to the industrial military complex, it's beyond reproach, and it should not exist at all. So the fact that it does exist should be obvious, that it's just an imperialist tactic to keep the islands in debt, as it were, and to control them and control their political systems. So we're at we've been on for 48 minutes. We should get back to our myths. And let's see, myth 3: statehood promoted by the plebiscite as a model of economic development. Should we just go on and keep breaking these ideas down?
Yeah, I think we need to be brief in order to get through them. So on this one, I can just speak really quickly and link it to the point about PROMESA, which is like, PROMESA means promise, right? So this is supposed to be a promise to care for Puerto Rico and its redevelopment. And yet we've already seen that broken promise. And so if that, as Giovanni said earlier, if there's, it's a promise that comes with it, it's a carrot attached to a stick, if you will, in that it's like, oh, we promise to help care for you in this paternalistic way. That's like, as long as we can have this board of governors control every decision that is made for your people. And so, Puerto Rico has already had a taste of what it's like to have US support and oversight, and we already see what that looks like, right? And so then when we look at, all you have to do is look at southern states in the United States. Earlier we were talking about Mike being from the Rust Belt, which is, kind of the like middle part of, post-industrial United States, basically, and looking at the southern states, like many of those states were like readopted into the Union after the Civil War, and then as there was this like Western conquest that continued, right? But like those states, even to date, get the least amount of actual funding and support. They have the highest poverty rates. And some of that is because of local governance, but a lot of that is because of these same narratives that have been sold to people that say, oh, we should be self-reliant and we should, be all of these things that teach us to internalize responsibility for the problems that we're facing, as opposed to point the finger at people who have all the wealth and yet are taking no real responsibility for caring for the people with that wealth. And instead, keep it for themselves or use it on things like the military that send more and more of our children to go fight in these endless wars. And then the last thing, earlier in the chat, Giovanni said, no one really knows how we got this debt. We were just told we owe. And I saw someone say, that's right, we don't owe them, they owe us. And I think that that's a perfect point on this, is that like an economic development model that still deepens Puerto Rico's dependence on a nation that has clearly demonstrated it doesn't care about our people is not the economic development model that we want. I think that the economic development model that we want is building our own relationships and power over time, and understand that there has to be a sequencing to that and a process to that, right? But it's not something you can necessarily undo in a day. But ultimately, like, if we're talking about this referendum as an opportunity to make known what our true goal and what our true North Star is, I think it should be self-determination, Puerto Rico's real ability to make its own decisions for itself, as opposed to the United States imposing its will and not actually taking responsibility for its neglect.
Sorry, I'm slacking. Yes, here we go. Let's move on to the next myth, because we got 9, and let's knock this out in a couple of minutes. So let's see. Myth number 4: statehood promoted by the plebiscite provides equality. Let's just knock that out real quick. Why is that a myth?
I feel like we've covered that in multiple ways now.
we have, haven't we? We've really done it. Myth number 5: statehood would integrate us into a multinational country. Obviously absurd, right? Myth number
again, sorry, I know we're just like I think I was technically supposed to take this one, so I'll just say I already said a lot about this, and literally that same relationship is enshrined in the Constitution with Indigenous nations on Turtle Island, who are officially recognized, right? The Constitution says that Congress is supposed to make treaties with those nations and uphold those treaties with respect to those nations' sovereignty. And I mean, anyone who knows anything about the history or the present of how the United States deals with those nations, it is not in a way that actually honors that nationality, that separate nationality and independence and sovereignty. And we've seen that, we saw that at Standing Rock. We see that right now as the Kumeyaay people are fighting the border. We see that in the Hawaiian Kingdom, as Hawaiian people are still trying to reclaim their own protection of their mauna. There's, everywhere you look, pick a nation and I'll show you a nation that's rights and sovereignty are being trampled on. And if you want to learn more about that, I encourage folks to check out the Land Back campaign that just got launched on Indigenous Peoples Day through Indian Collective. And they're doing work around, those nations standing up for themselves and claiming their sovereignty.
Okay, so what I'll do is I'll just read off the myths here, and then at the end we can talk about what we feel like stands out. See, myth number 5 was statehood would integrate us into a multinational country. Myth number 6: statehood would give us more control over our future. Myth number 7: the statehood offered by a plebiscite provides a dignified exit. Myth number 8: our international representations are safe with statehood. Myth number 9: statehood is possible without the development of sovereignty. Okay, so those are our 9 myths. Is there anything else? Is there anything that we need to review and clarify? Anything anybody wants to jump on there?
I think that go for it, Giovanni.
Yeah, I'll say one thing about what was it, myth number 8. Why have a mediator, right, in international representation, when you can represent yourself directly, and establish relationships with other countries directly, make your own treaties directly with other countries, versus having a mediator in a faraway land in Washington, D.C. Yeah, so I think that myth is easily debunked. I mean, we saw with Maria where countries, independent sovereign countries, were sending aid to Puerto Rico, were shipping aid to Puerto Rico, and they were pretty much turned around because they were violating the Jones Act. The Jones Act is this archaic 1917 thing that they created, that any type of supplies entering Puerto Rico have to enter through American ships. So in theory, not in theory, but this is how it actually works, is that if shipments are to go into Puerto Rico, they have to first be downloaded in, I believe it's in Jacksonville, Florida, and then put on another containers, another ships, American ships, so they can go into Puerto Rico and be dispersed there, right? So because they were violating the Jones Act, right, this ships with aid that came, to render aid to Puerto Ricans were pretty much turned around, So yeah, so that myth right there is easily debunked.
Thanks, Giovanni. Oh, sorry, Mike. I saw you on mute.
Go wild. So yeah, we've been on for almost an hour, 4 minutes till the top of the hour. I feel like we've done a good job of covering the topic. I think one thing that's worth clarifying and emphasizing is that we're all veterans, that we've all witnessed the empire from the inside, and we have a deep personal and emotional connection with these issues, and that we all feel very confident speaking about them through our personal experiences. And if anybody has questions about that, or challenges our wherewithal or our knowledge of that, then I mean, we're happy to go through it and explain it, because I was boots on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I saw how people were treated there, and it was horrific, and I'll never get over it. I'll always be left with that trauma, and there's nothing really too different of the colonization of the U.S. or the colonization of Puerto Rico and the colonization of Iraq and Afghanistan. They're all deeply connected. So final comments and questions to close up. Does anybody have anything they'd like to add and clarify, and call to actions?
Thank you. So yeah, definitely a call to action. You can go to that website that you see scrolling on the bottom of your screen. Number one, we need support. So we are a grassroots collective campaign. We don't have money funneling in like the major political parties that want the yes vote. So all donations are appreciated and put to good use, providing political education, trying to help people understand their choices and options and what each of them mean, which is something that the dominant party right now is not really doing. Also, too, you can go to that website, and there's a spot where if you're in the diaspora, your voice counts in this too. This affects all of us as a whole nation. And you can leave a testimony, a written one. You can make a video and submit it as well to help people understand what a no vote means and why that's important, and why you would encourage folks back home to vote no. And with that, I invite Brittany and Giovanni too, if you have a message for the diaspora or just anything else that you want to say to people living back here in Puerto Rico about what they're going to do on November 3rd.
Sure. Yeah, I just want to say thank you again for this opportunity to share my thoughts and my story. And it's really an honor, as I'm in my own very emotional journey of reconnecting to my homeland. And so I just want to express solidarity with, my relatives who are on the islands, as Monisha pointed out, and just really let you know that folks here, including About Face, but beyond, many of us represent many organizations who are interested in whatever ways that we can be showing up in solidarity. And so today that meant giving a megaphone to this struggle a little bit. But I also know that this is a big question. We're in times that are potentially going to become revolutionary times, and certainly a pivotal moment, right? We're seeing a lot of pivotal things that we're facing, as well as pivotal decisions in terms of like figuring out what it means to strategically relate to these institutions that are not built for us, but do govern our lives, whether we like it or not right now, right? And I know as a person, I have been having a lot of discussions, deep, nuanced discussions about what does it mean to vote when either person you're voting for any particular office ultimately is a person serving the empire, and like how do we, as people who believe in true liberation and true revolutionary struggle, how do we relate in a moment like this in a way that serves our ultimate long-term goal? And I'm not here to say one way that folks should choose to relate to that, but what I will say is that whatever our choice is, it should be rooted in that long-term goal. It should be not a personal what feels good in this moment or what seems on its surface to make a statement, but it should be something that is rooted in what do we need to do to strategically advance our positioning toward that goal of liberation. And as long as that's the North Star, you and I are in the same struggle, even if we make different choices. And so again, thank you for that opportunity. And I hope that, like I said, our relatives, feel seen and heard in this moment, and just know that our hearts are with you. And thank you, Monisha, especially for all of the work that you're doing to advance this grassroots campaign that I think is really important.
Yeah, first and foremost, I want to say thank you, Mike, Monisha, Brittany, for all coming together, and bringing this topic forward. I feel that this topic get often neglected. One of the things about Maria, the Hurricane Maria, when there was there was questions asked here in the United States, where the majority of American populations didn't even know that Puerto Ricans were citizens. We've been having this relationship for the last 120 years, and the majority of the people in the United States does not know that we're citizens. That should tell you something right there, right? So I encourage my fellow Puerto Ricans, whether in the island, in La Islas, to vote no. Why enter this relationship? Vote no. This is a farce. Congress don't even recognize this. So it's right there. It's a farce right there. It's telling you right there. It's a farce. Don't play yourself, like we used to say back in the days, right? Also, people my generation and the generation before me, I encourage you to reevaluate your learning, reevaluate the education that you've received throughout these years, right? And follow the youth, because the youth right now are pointing to the right direction, right? They might lack experience, right? But they have their heart is in a good place, right? And their conscience is different than when we grew up, and they're leading us towards a land of possibilities, a land of justice, a land of inequality for all of us, for all people, not just some, but for all of us. Mandela said, we're not free until all of us are free.
Word. And with that, we've been on for an hour and we'll close. Please reach out to About Face. If you have any further questions, we're happy to answer them. Share this on Facebook and YouTube and anywhere else you can share it. Thanks for watching, and we hope to be back soon. So that's it. That's the end of the show. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, About Face.